Most people believe nations have allies, friends who stand together through crisis, partners bound by shared values and history. But history tells a different story. Nations don't have friends, they have interests. And the moment those interests change, so does the alliance. Watch how world leaders speak about each other. The handshakes, the public speeches about unity, the signed treaties. It all looks like friendship, like genuine partnership built on trust and mutual respect. But look closer at what happens when circumstances shift. Yesterday's trusted ally becomes today's competitor. Yesterday's enemy becomes today's strategic partner. The relationship didn't change because of betrayal. It changed because interests realigned. Diplomacy is not built on trust. It's built on calculation. Every handshake is asking the same question. What do we gain from this arrangement? Every treaty is securing specific advantages. Every alliance is serving particular strategic goals. The friendly language, the warm rhetoric, the promises of eternal partnership. Those are tools, not truths. Because every nation is quietly running the same calculation. Does this relationship serve our interests or threaten them? And when the answer changes, the relationship changes with it. No explanation needed, no apology given, just a quiet shift in positioning. This is not a new pattern. It's the oldest pattern in geopolitics. Throughout history, alliances have shifted constantly. Nations that fought together in one war face each other in the next. Enemies become temporary partners when a greater threat emerges. Partners become rivals when their interests diverge. Not because anyone is uniquely treacherous, because the logic of national interest is stronger than any promise. Think about the major alliances of the past century. How many remained stable when circumstances changed? How many partnerships survived shifts in economic or strategic advantage? How many friendships lasted once they stopped serving both parties? Almost none. Because nations don't operate on sentiment, they operate on strategy. And strategy demands flexibility that friendship cannot provide. The language of betrayal is what populations use to describe this. They feel shocked when alliances dissolve. They feel betrayed when partners become competitors. They thought the relationship was based on shared values. But values are the language used to justify alliances. Interests are what create them. And when interests change, values get reinterpreted to match. Nations don't betray friends. They simply follow their interests. And if you look closely, this is exactly how people behave too. We maintain relationships that serve us. We invest in connections that provide value. We distance ourselves from those who no longer align with our goals. Not because we're calculating or cold, because it's how all relationships work when stripped of romantic narrative. The difference is nations are honest about it, at least to themselves, if not to their populations. There's a reason this pattern repeats so consistently. It's not accidental or coincidental. It's structural, built into how power operates at the highest levels. When you're responsible for millions of lives, for national security, for economic stability, sentiment becomes a luxury you cannot afford. Every decision carries weight that personal relationships never approach. Choose the wrong ally and your economy collapses. Trust the wrong partner and your security is compromised. Maintain the wrong relationship and your position weakens while competitors strengthen. These aren't abstract possibilities. They're historical realities that have destroyed nations throughout time. So leaders learn quickly that survival requires a different calculus than friendship, a calculus based on cold assessment of advantage and risk. Who can provide what we need? Who poses a threat to our interests? Who can be useful temporarily, even if we don't trust them long term? These are the questions that shape international relationships, not shared history, not cultural affinity, not personal bonds between leaders. Just strategic value measured against strategic cost. At the highest level of power, morality becomes strategy. Leaders understand something most people refuse to accept, that survival and dominance require decisions that can't always be explained through moral frameworks. That maintaining national interests sometimes means abandoning partnerships that no longer serve. That loyalty, as a principle, is a luxury reserved for times when it doesn't conflict with strategic advantage. This doesn't make leaders evil. It makes them realistic about how power operates, because the alternative, maintaining alliances out of sentiment, is how nations become weak, how they get exploited by partners who are less sentimental, how they sacrifice their own interests to preserve relationships that are already dead. History is filled with examples of nations that chose loyalty over interest, and almost all of them paid severely for that choice. They honored commitments that no longer served them. They maintained partnerships that had become liabilities. They refused to adapt when circumstances demanded flexibility. And they weakened themselves in the process, while their competitors, less bound by sentiment, repositioned and strengthened. That's the brutal lesson history teaches. Loyalty to outdated alliances is how you lose in the long game of power. Flexibility in relationships is how you survive. And survival, not honor, is what determines which nations remain powerful across generations. That's why the most dangerous betrayals rarely come from enemies. Enemies are predictable. Their opposition is clear. You know where they stand, what they want, how they'll act. But allies have access. They know your strategies, your weaknesses, your dependencies. They've been inside your decision-making processes. They understand your vulnerabilities because you shared them in confidence. And when their interests shift, when maintaining the alliance becomes costly, they use that access. Not dramatically, not with declarations of war, just quietly, through economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, strategic repositioning. They begin competing in areas where you're weakest. They form new partnerships with your rivals. They slowly withdraw support while maintaining the appearance of friendship. The alliance doesn't end with a betrayal. It just fades as both parties pursue diverging interests. And by the time anyone notices, the relationship is already over. What's left is just the formal structure, the diplomatic niceties. But the substance, the actual cooperation and mutual support, that disappeared long ago. The world looks peaceful on the surface. Diplomatic summits, trade agreements, cooperative frameworks, all the machinery of international friendship operating smoothly. Leaders smile for cameras, sign documents, issue joint statements. Everything appears stable, collaborative, built on genuine partnership. But underneath the handshakes, the competition never stops. Nations are constantly maneuvering for advantage, competing economically through trade policy and currency manipulation, competing militarily through arms development and strategic positioning, competing for influence through aid, alliances, and institutional control. Every interaction, even cooperative ones, carries a strategic dimension. When nations work together on climate agreements, they're also positioning for economic advantage. When they coordinate on security issues, they're also gathering intelligence. When they engage in cultural exchange, they're also projecting soft power. The cooperation is real in the sense that it serves both parties, but it's temporary in the sense that it lasts only as long as interests align. And interests shift constantly. new threats emerge that reorder priorities. Economic conditions change that alter dependencies. Leadership transitions that bring different strategic visions. Technological advantages appear that shift power balances. Each shift recalculates the value of every relationship, and relationships that no longer serve get quietly downgraded. Not abandoned necessarily, but deprioritized. Maintained at minimal cost while attention shifts to more valuable partnerships. Resources flow to alliances that provide current advantage. Effort goes to relationships that serve immediate strategic goals. And older partnerships, ones built on circumstances that no longer exist, slowly atrophy. This is the silent war that never ends. Not fought with weapons, but with positioning. Not declared openly, but acknowledged privately. Every nation engaged in it, every leader managing it. While populations believe in the friendly facade, the public sees cooperation and assumes genuine friendship. They see agreements and believe in lasting partnership. They see diplomatic language and take it at face value. But leaders know what's happening beneath that surface. They understand that every smile masks a calculation, that every agreement serves specific interests, that every partnership is conditional and temporary, and they plan accordingly. They don't build strategy on the assumption that allies will remain allies forever. They build contingencies for when relationships shift. They maintain flexibility to realign when interests change. They never become so dependent on any single partnership that its loss would be catastrophic, because they know the fundamental rule. Power has a rule most people refuse to accept. Loyalty is temporary. Interests are permanent. You can change allies, shift partnerships, realign relationships. But your interests, those remain constant: security, resources, influence, survival. Those don't change just because a partnership ends. They're the foundation beneath every relationship. And when relationships conflict with those foundations, the relationships bend. Not the interests, never the interests. Because interests are what define national survival. Security interests determine whether your nation can defend itself. Economic interests determine whether your population prospers. Strategic interests determine whether your influence grows or shrinks. These cannot be sacrificed for loyalty to any partnership. They cannot be compromised for sentiment toward any ally. They must be protected and advanced regardless of which relationships that costs. That's why nations don't have friends. Only interests. Friends imply emotional bonds that transcend practical benefit. Friends suggest loyalty that survives shifting circumstances. Friends mean staying committed even when it costs you. But nations can't afford that kind of friendship because the cost of misplaced loyalty is measured in weakened position, lost advantage, strategic vulnerability. In economic decline, security threats, reduced influence, in outcomes that hurt millions of people who depend on their nation's strength. So they maintain partnerships that serve interests and call it friendship for public consumption. But internally, in the rooms where decisions are made, everyone understands this is strategy, not sentiment. This is calculation, not connection. This is interest determining relationships, not relationships determining interests. The language of friendship serves a purpose. It makes alliances more palatable to populations. It creates social pressure for partners to cooperate. It provides moral justification for strategic decisions. But it's always been language, not reality. The reality is interests aligning temporarily, shared threats creating common cause, mutual benefits making cooperation worthwhile. And when those conditions change, so does the relationship, regardless of what the public rhetoric claims. regardless of how long the partnership lasted, regardless of how much history the nations share. The same rule that governs nations governs human relationships. People cooperate while interests align. They invest in relationships that provide value, meaning, growth, support. They maintain connections that serve their goals and well-being. And when those alignments break, when relationships stop serving both parties, distance appears. Not always dramatically, not always consciously, just a gradual fading as both people pursue diverging paths. We call it growing apart, but it's the same mechanism as shifting alliances. Interests changed, and the relationship adjusted to match. Someone's career takes them to a different city. Someone's life priorities shift in incompatible directions. Someone's values evolve in ways that create friction. Someone's needs change in ways the relationship can no longer meet. And slowly, without anyone deciding to end it, the relationship fades. Not because anyone is bad or wrong, because interests diverged and the relationship couldn't survive that divergence. The difference is we lie to ourselves about it. We tell ourselves relationships are about love transcending practical benefit, about loyalty surviving any circumstance, about commitment that ignores whether the relationship still serves us. But watch how people actually behave. How relationships fade when they stop providing value. How connections weaken when life circumstances diverge. How partnerships end when interests no longer align. How people who swore eternal friendship drift apart when their paths separate. How marriages that served both parties dissolve when they stop serving one or both. How business partnerships that seemed unbreakable end when strategic visions diverge. We're not more moral than nations. We're just less honest about how we operate. Nations acknowledge that relationships serve interests. We pretend interests shouldn't matter in relationships, but they do matter. They always have. And the healthiest relationships are the ones where both people's interests genuinely align, where the partnership serves both parties in ways that remain consistent, where the value isn't one-sided or temporary, where both people are growing in compatible directions, where needs are being met mutually and sustainably. Those relationships last not because of loyalty that defies logic, but because interests remain aligned long enough for genuine bond to form, long enough for the relationship to become valuable beyond its practical benefits, long enough for connection to deepen into something that transcends utility. But even then, even in the strongest relationships, interests still matter. They're just more complex than simple transactional exchange. The interest becomes the relationship itself, the connection, the shared history. That becomes valuable enough to preserve even through temporary misalignments. But complete divergence of fundamental interests, that destroys even the deepest bonds eventually. Because you can't maintain a relationship that actively works against both people's well-being. That requires too much sacrifice, creates too much resentment. Eventually, interests win. Just like they do between nations, the world calls it diplomacy when nations do this. Pragmatic, strategic, necessary for survival. Leaders are praised for putting national interests first, for being clear-eyed about relationships serving specific purposes, for maintaining flexibility in partnerships, for realigning when circumstances demand it. But when individuals do the same thing, we call it using people. As if nations operating on interests is wisdom, but people operating on interests is betrayal. As if there's some fundamental difference in the mechanism. But there isn't. The mechanism is identical. Relationships exist because they serve both parties, and when they stop serving, they end or transform. The only question is whether we're honest about it. Nations are honest, at least internally. They know every alliance is conditional, every partnership is strategic, every friendship is actually a convergence of interests, and they plan accordingly. They don't expect loyalty to survive diverging interests. They don't build strategy on the assumption that relationships are permanent. They just maintain useful partnerships while they're useful and shift when circumstances demand it, without guilt, without shame, without pretending it's something other than what it is. Just clear-eyed recognition that relationships serve purposes. And when those purposes change, relationships must change too. That's not cynicism. That's just understanding how power operates, how all relationships operate when you strip away the comfortable illusions. People want to believe in bonds that transcend interest, in loyalty that survives any circumstance, in partnerships that last regardless of whether they still serve. And maybe, in rare cases, such relationships exist, but they're exceptions, not rules. The rule is simpler and colder. Interests create relationships. Aligned interests maintain them. Diverging interests end them. Everything else is narrative we create to make that reality more comfortable. The world calls it diplomacy. But behind the polite language, power is always negotiating, always calculating, always asking the same question. Does this relationship serve my interests? And adjusting accordingly when the answer changes. Not because power is evil or relationships are meaningless, but because survival requires honesty about what relationships are. Temporary alignments of interest between parties pursuing their own goals. Sometimes those alignments last decades and create genuine bonds. Sometimes they dissolve quickly when circumstances shift, but they're always fundamentally about interests. Nations know this. They've always known this. They just let populations believe in friendship, because populations need that belief to support alliances. But in the rooms where decisions are made, everyone understands. Nations don't have friends, only interests. And the sooner you understand that, the clearer you see how the world actually works. Not through comforting narratives about international friendship, but through the cold mechanics of strategic advantage that govern everything, always have, always will.